The Nintendo Switch Online service is a great way to introduce old games to a younger audience. And if you don't know what Nintendo Switch Online is, it's a service that allows you to play a library of retro games. You have the standard membership that's only $20 a year, and it gives you access to NES games, Super Nintendo, and Game Boy. Then there's the expansion pack that offers all of those consoles I just mentioned, as well as Nintendo 64, Sega Genesis, and Game Boy Advance. So let's talk about all of the co-op games available on Nintendo Switch Online. Starting with the NES.
Balloon Fight. This is one of the earliest co-op games on the NES. This came out in 1984. It's very similar to Joust as far as gameplay goes. You tap a button to fly higher, and as you release the button, you'll slowly float down, and you want to land on top of the enemies to pop their balloons. It's a really fun and addicting co-op experience. I played this game for hours with my brother at times. It's very simple, but very addicting. And for an early NES game, I think it holds up great.
Cluclu Land is one of the NES launch titles. It kind of takes the Pac-Man formula, but twists it around a little bit. You control a fish-like character named Bubbles, and you go through the maze. But what sets it apart is that you grab onto these poles and you spin around. The controls take a little bit of getting used to, but once you get the hang of it, it's a pretty decent game. Although it's not one of my favorite co-op NES games. Devil World. Now this one exclusively came out on the Famicom in Japan. It was created by Shigeru Miyamoto. This is another one with a maze setting, similar to Pac-Man. The objective here is to avoid enemies and collect crosses to defeat the demons and open the gate. The unique mechanic here, the maze itself kind of scrolls side to side. This one's definitely a decent game, and it's surprising that it never got a US release. But that's probably thanks to all of the religious imagery here that Nintendo of America just simply did not want to touch.
Double Dragon 2 on the NES is definitely the best Double Dragon game on NES. And, you know, it's one of my favorite Double Dragon games ever. In this version, it takes the controls of Renegade, where the A button always punches to the right and the B button is always hitting to the left. It takes a minute to get used to, but once you wrap your head around it, it actually makes sense, because if there's enemies on both sides of you, you just push one button and you will kick that way, and push the other button and you'll punch the other way. It's an effective way of fighting. There's so many moves you can do. You could do a flying knee, you could do a jump spinning kick. It always takes me a minute to relearn how to do these moves and to pull them off, because it's all about timing. But once you do it, you feel like a true badass when you can jump knee a guy and make them fly right off the edge. It's one of the most satisfying things you can ever do in a video game. The only thing I hate about this game is the platforming. They need to just take that right out. But other than that, this is another really great beat 'em up on the NES. I've only been able to beat it without cheat codes one time, and that was with a far more experienced friend, where he did most of the heavy lifting. But you know what? I can consistently get to the level where you have to do platforming parts. Then I die. But I can get to there pretty consistently.
Kung Fu Heroes. This is a game that I have a lot of nostalgia for. It's basically a single screen beat 'em up. The game was made by Culture Brain, who later went on to make the Little Ninja Bros games. I used to play this one with my little brother all of the time. Basically, you just jump around, you can land on enemies to destroy them or punch them. Once you destroy all the enemies, then you can move on to the next stage. The concept is very simple, but it becomes pretty addictive, I think. We also have the original Mario Bros. So this is before Super Mario Bros. And it's actually a co-op game. It's a single screen platformer. The objective here is just to take out all of the enemies on the screen and collect coins and then move on. There's a bit of a competitive nature as well, as you can run into each other and jump onto each other's heads.
River City Ransom. Yes, when it comes to the original NES game, this one is the best. You probably all know this game. It has the 2D beat 'em up action, but there's also some exploration. You're going around trying to find each boss. You're gathering money. You're powering yourself up. You're getting stronger. You're learning new moves. You're going to the different towns. You're trying out mini games. You're getting in the spa to show off your butt. River City Ransom is just such a solid experience. It's rare that a game that came out in the 80s holds up so well. And one of the things I love about this game is it's not extremely difficult. If you die, you just lose some money, and then you can just regain that money. And it's not that hard to gather money up fast and buy power-ups. Once you learn how to play this game, it's one of the most accessible games on the NES. Anyone can play it, and beat it, I think. It doesn't take a lot of skill. It just takes some patience and some understanding. This is truly just, to me, one of the best beat 'em ups of all time and one of the best co-op games of all time. I know Scat is a shoot 'em up. It definitely reminds me of Forgotten World, where you actually control human characters flying around. This is a later release by Natsume, and it's an incredibly difficult game to play. I use cheats on this. I'm not a real gamer, I guess. Sometimes I just want to see all the levels, alright? This game just looks great, and it plays really well too. You have a turret that is flying and rotating constantly, but you could push a button to lock it in. So if you want, you could be shooting forward while your turret shoots behind you at the same time. It adds an extra layer of strategy to a shoot 'em up. This is another one that I just didn't know about until fairly recently, in the last 5 or 10 years. It's not a game I grew up with, but I'm glad I found it now. It's kind of a hidden gem, I think, right? Shadow of the Ninja is another Natsume game, and it's kind of like Ninja Gaiden, but co-op. I don't know why, but I am a sucker for any game where you can climb on walls or climb on the ceiling. Why is that? I don't know, but you can do that in this, and it's cool, all right? And yeah, you can get different power-ups. You can get a sword, you can get shuriken, you can get this chain dart thingy. I forgot what those are called. This is another one that's really hard, but with enough practice, you could probably beat it. Yes, this is one of my favorite co-op games on the NES. One of my favorite ninja games, probably. I had no idea this game existed when I was a kid, and I was deeply obsessed with martial arts and ninjas, so yeah, I would have loved this. I wish I played it when I was a kid, but I'm glad I was able to stumble upon it as an adult. It's absolutely worth trying.
Snake, Rattle, and Roll. This game is made by Rare, and the gameplay here is pretty unique. It takes an isometric view, and you play as these two snakes. You go around and you eat these balls to grow your tail longer. Once you get your tail to a specific length, you're able to go to the end and unlock the exit to move forward. I really like the concept here, but it is kind of difficult to control. But it's still definitely worth trying out. And we have the original Twin Bee. As far as I know, this is pretty much the start of the subgenre cute 'em ups, as it's a vertical scrolling shoot 'em up that is cute. The whole point of the game is to destroy the enemies and collect bells, which offered various power-ups. I was never a big fan of the Twin Bee series. I think it's fun, but I always get pretty bored with it pretty quick. But I don't really have anything negative to say about it. And now let's move on to the Super Nintendo games. Battletoads in Battlemania is the follow-up to the original Battletoads on NES. This has a lot of the same gameplay, but I feel like this one is a little bit more approachable. It's not one of the most difficult games of all time like the original. At least I was able to get quite a bit further than I ever could on the NES game. You still have the powerful attacks where your character morphs into various different objects and knocks the enemies back. But like the original, it also has gameplay that changes up. Of course, it has the foundation of being a beat 'em up, but it also has some other sections. This game might not be as memorable as the original Battletoads, but it might be the better game. Double Dragon Battletoads is an excellent beat 'em up that combines two of the most popular beat 'em up franchises into one, Double Dragon and Battletoads. And it's actually one of the best games in both of those series. It actually plays more like a Battletoads game than a Double Dragon game. It has the same similar humor. When you're fighting the female enemies, you grab them by the hair and whip them around, and then you can like pound the guys into the ground. And it has a speed bike level as well. I love this game, but it does get very difficult very quick. But I still think it's a really great beat 'em up. Brawl Brothers is a pretty mediocre beat 'em up that is definitely trying to capture the popularity of Streets of Rage and Final Fight. I think this one's really only recommended to fans of the beat 'em up genre that have played most of the popular games. This one's just very generic and doesn't have much of anything new to offer. Donkey Kong Country. This is Rare bringing Donkey Kong into a new generation. I remember when this game came out and it kind of just blew everyone's mind. And yeah, now graphically it might look a little bit dated, but those pre-rendered sprites were really impressive to see at the time. That being said, the gameplay still is intact, and I still consider this one and the sequel to be two of the best platformers of all time. Donkey Kong Country 2, in my opinion, is the best of the Donkey Kong Country series. Primarily because you get to play as Diddy Kong and Dixie Kong, which Those are my two favorite characters, specifically Dixie Kong because she's able to glide with her hair. This is an incredibly difficult 2D platformer, but the music is absolutely amazing. Just listen to some of these songs. Truly just some of my favorite video game music ever. Like all of the Donkey Kong Country games, this includes a tag team mode, so you don't specifically get to play simultaneous co-op, but at least you're both in a level at the same time. So you gotta be alert at all times, and you can switch between players on the fly. I think this is one of the best 2D platformers of all time. Joe and Mac Caveman Ninjas is a port of the arcade game. The Super Nintendo version is a solid port with some really nice colors and graphics. It's a 2D platformer, and the Super Nintendo version adds a couple features that the Genesis version was missing, like an overworld map, and also the final boss is different. This game is pretty good. Joe and Mac 2, Lost in the Tropics, is actually the third game in the Joe and Mac series after Joe and Mac and then Congo's Caper. I don't know what that's about. But the point being is this is another great 2D platformer with co-op, and this one came out exclusively on the Super Nintendo. It doesn't really add a whole lot new to the genre or the series, but if you're a fan of the Joe and Mac games, you'll definitely like this one as well. Kirby Superstar is a game that's near and dear to my heart. I played this game for countless hours on my Super Nintendo with my little brother back in the day. And to this day, it's still just my favorite Kirby game of all time. I believe it was the first Kirby game to include co-op gameplay. It introduced the helper character. So basically Kirby, when he copies an enemy and turns into that power-up, you're able to then convert that power-up into a helper character, and player 2 can take control of them. This adds a lot of variety to the gameplay. Not only can Kirby take on any ability, it gives you the opportunity for the second player to pretty much just change characters at any time. If you see a new enemy that you want to try out, it's pretty simple to convert it to a helper. Again, I'm going to be saying this a lot for this list, but this is just one of the best co-op games of all time. Kirby Dream Land 3. This is a late release for the Super Nintendo, and it's kind of different from the other Kirby games. Starting with the visuals, it has a really nice art style that kind of looks like crayons or watercolor. Very impressive for the Super Nintendo hardware. The second player can control a character named Gooey. Another cool addition here is that you can get these animal helpers, kind of like in Donkey Kong Country, and they just add a little bit of variety to the gameplay. I really love this game. If you have to choose this or Kirby Superstars, honestly, Kirby Superstars is probably the better game, but you can't go wrong with either title. Peacekeepers. It's a sequel to Brawl Brothers, and it's the final installment, the Rushing Beat trilogy. The first game is Rival Turf, and then you have Brawl Brothers, and then Peacekeepers. It does add a few new features, such as new special attacks. There's some branching paths that you can choose, and multiple endings. That being said, the gameplay still feels a bit generic. It's not a top tier beat 'em up, but it is a little bit better than Brawl Brothers. Poppin' Twin B. So this is another Twin B game, but for the 16-bit hardware, and it's definitely a step up. This one came out exclusively in Japan on the Super Famicom. The gameplay is pretty much the same as the original Twin B, very colorful. I love the art style here, and you're going to be collecting a lot of bells to power yourself up. I don't know what else to say about this game. It's not a bad game. I don't think it's a great game either, but if you like Twin B, you'll like this game. Super Ninja Boy is a co-op RPG that mixes in beat-em-up gameplay. In the US, on the NES, we had Little Ninja Brothers, and there were other games that came out exclusively in Japan under the title Super Chinese. So this is the 16-bit continuation of that series. It has the same top-down open-world areas with random battles that turn into beat-em-up gameplay. Every time you win a battle, you gain experience points and can level up your characters. This is truly a co-op RPG, which is definitely a rarity for the time. If you haven't played Super Ninja Boy, give it a try. Wild Guns is an excellent Cabal shooter. If you don't know what a Cabal shooter is, it takes place in third person and you move side to side, avoiding all of the enemy fire, while simultaneously using a cursor to shoot the enemies. So it takes a little bit of getting used to, but once you can wrap your head around it, this control scheme is actually pretty effective. Again, this is just an excellent co-op game. Like a lot of these games, it can get really difficult. The visuals are great here, the gameplay is incredibly polished, there's a lot of detail in the environment and the bosses. Unfortunately, there are no co-op games on Game Boy. There are some multiplayer games if you want to try those though, but you will need 2 Nintendo Switch consoles as well as the Switch Online membership. Now let's talk about the co-op Sega Genesis games.
Alien Storm is another side-scrolling beat-em-up, but this time, you're going to be fighting aliens. But the gameplay changes up quite a bit here. This one's created by the same team that did Golden Axe. Again, the controls might be a little bit weird at first, but once you get the hang of it, it feels really good. You also have these auto-scrolling levels where your characters are running, and then you have on-rail shooter sections. So that's what I really love about this game, is it never gets boring. You can beat the whole game in probably 30 minutes. It has just the right amount of challenge to make it a satisfying experience.
Altered Beast. So this is definitely an early title that came out on the Genesis that really showed that this hardware could take an arcade game and bring it into the home consoles and make it actually feel like the original experience. This is pretty much like a beat 'em up, but it's a single playing beat 'em up. You just walk left to right and you can get various power-ups. First you turn into a buff dude, and then you can turn into a dragon and other things. I've never been the biggest fan of Altered Beast, but there's something charming about it. If you're a fan of Sega or just co-op games in general, everyone needs to at least try Altered Beast once.
Contra Hardcore is a Sega Genesis exclusive, and to me this is my favorite of the Contra series. The Super Nintendo had the Alien Wars, which is also a really great game, but I kind of prefer this one. First, you get to choose between various characters. That's a nice bonus, but also just all the levels have this really nice dark atmosphere that just really fits the vibe of the Contra games. Like most Contra games, this is an incredibly difficult game, but if you get a good co-op partner, each level that you beat is definitely going to be very rewarding. So I gotta put Contra Hardcore high up on this list. It's definitely one of the best co-op games on the Genesis. Golden Axe is considered to be one of the all-time classic side-scrolling beat-em-ups, and that's for good reason. It has a really great soundtrack. The combat is really solid, and the characters are memorable. You can play as the dwarf, the warrior, or the female warrior. I don't really know what the term is for this. What do you call her? I don't know. She's a warrior, right? Each with slightly different stats and abilities. But one of the things that make this game stand out the most is that you can cast spells where you can do screen clearing special attacks. This is one of those games. Once you get into the rhythm of it, it becomes very satisfying. And once you get better at the game, you could pretty easily beat it in one sitting. When it comes to run and gun platformers, I don't think many games can really compete with Gunstar Heroes. It's like Contra, but even more intense. When starting the game, the player can choose between either a free or fixed firing stance. The fixed stance makes it so you can't move and shoot at the same time, with the benefit being it's easier to aim, but you're not going to be able to avoid the enemies as easily, while the free stance makes it so you can run and shoot around freely. So it's nice to be able to have that choice. But one of the coolest features is that you can pick up various weapons and combine them with other ones to create unique combo attacks. The gameplay also changes up a bit. You have platforming, you have incredible huge boss fights, but you also have these parts where you're in a minecart and you're moving between the ceiling and the ground. There's a lot of creativity here in the level design, and this is another one with a really great soundtrack. To me, Gunstar Heroes is my personal favorite run and gun platformer of all time, and is truly one of the best co-op games ever.
Sonic the Hedgehog 2. So this is one of my favorite games of all time. It's not one of the best co-op games, but it is one of the best 2D platformers ever made, and still to this day, it's my favorite Sonic game. Unfortunately, it's just not a very equal co-op experience, as the second player controls Tails, and he often just gets left in the dust while Sonic runs around and does whatever he needs to do. Nonetheless, if you're playing this with a younger sibling or one of your kids, it could still be a really fun experience, and Tails can really shine at the boss fights.
Streets of Rage 2. It just got everything right, from the combat, to the graphics,
to the character selection, to the boss fights, and to the incredible soundtrack by Yuzo Koshiro. Just listen to these beats. It's incredible that over 30 years later, people are still talking about this game as one of the best beat 'em ups. And not many games can really compete with it. Just everything about it feels right. You got the grab maneuver, so you can either punch your enemies or throw them, which is a really great strategy when you have a ledge and you want to just throw the enemies off the edge. You also have the desperation moves, and each character's is different. This is incredibly helpful when you're surrounded by enemies or if you get grabbed and you want to break free. The difficulty is just perfectly balanced. If you have a skilled partner, you could pretty easily get through the whole game in one sitting. I just can't say enough about Streets of Rage 2. It's one of the best beat 'em ups of all time, but also just probably one of the best video games ever made. It's definitely my favorite. That's why. Toejam and Earl is another one of my favorite childhood video games. And to me, I think it's one of the best co-op games of all time. It's just a very unique experience. And it's definitely an early example of a roguelite. You have randomized levels as well as randomized items. The objective is to just find the ship pieces of each level, and once you gather those all up, you can complete the game. But every time you play the game, the levels are different, as they are procedurally generated. But what makes this game unique is that it's mostly a defensive experience. You don't really need to fight the enemies at all, you mostly just want to avoid them, and the majority of the items you pick up are just to help you defend yourself. You get high tops so you can run away from the enemies, you get wings so you can fly away from them. There are really only a few weapons that you can actually get, so that just really makes this game stand out. But the best feature is the co-op gameplay. This might be the earliest example of a dynamic split screen, and it works really well. If you're together, you're on one screen, and if you separate, the screen switches to split screen. And this makes exploring and looking for those ship pieces and presents a lot more manageable when you can split up and cover more ground. And of course, we gotta talk about the music. Just listen to this. Anyway, I can't say enough about Toejam and Earl. It's one of my favorite games of all time. Toejam and Earl in Panic on Funkatron. This is a definite departure from the original Toejam and Earl game. So instead of the slow-paced, top-down, defensive gameplay, this one is a 2D platformer. And now you are throwing jars to try to capture all of the humans that are invading Funkatron. This might be one of the best-looking Sega Genesis games. It's just very colorful. That being said, I've always been a much bigger fan of the original Toejam and Earl. But this game is definitely fun. I think it wears out its welcome. I played this game a lot when I was a kid, but I could never beat it. And finally, as an adult, maybe 5 years ago, I sat down and beat it with my brother, and I found it to be pretty frustrating. So I do enjoy this game, but I just think the first one is much better. Now let's talk about the Nintendo 64 games. Jet Force Gemini. This is a game made by Rare, and it's definitely a departure from some of the titles that they're known for up until this point. This is a fully 3D action platformer slash third-person shooter experience with a huge story in a huge world and a really great soundtrack. I was obsessed with this game when I was a kid, and I still think it has a lot going for it. But the camera and the controls did not age well. But one of the coolest features is there is a co-op assist mode. Pretty early on in the game, you get to a part where you have to collect all of the pieces of Floyd, the robot. Once you do that, a second player can now take control of Floyd. Unfortunately, this is just an assist mode. He can't participate in a lot of things and is ultimately just a little cursor that can move around and shoot down the enemies. That being said, if you do have a good partner, doubling up your firepower can be incredibly helpful. It's not the best co-op experience because it's not equal, but I still think that it's unique and definitely worth trying out. Perfect Dark is basically the spiritual successor to GoldenEye 007, but once this game came out, I never went back to GoldenEye because this game just did everything that game did, but in a better way. Primarily the variety of weapons. and the deathmatch allowed you to include bots, so that added some variety as well. But the main upgrade that this game had over GoldenEye was that you can play through the entire story mode in split-screen co-op. And still, to this day, I think that this is one of the best co-op first-person shooters ever made. Of course, the visuals are very dated, and the frame rate takes a huge hit when you play it in split-screen. If you're able to look past the technical problems that this game has, underneath is a really great first-person shooter. I played this game for countless hours when I was a kid, both in deathmatch and in the campaign mode. It's definitely one of the best co-op games on the system. Sin and Punishment came out exclusively in Japan. This game isn't necessarily known as a co-op game, but you are able to split up the tasks of controlling your character, where one player controls the jumping and movement, and the other player takes control of the shooting. And I think that this works really well as a co-op experience. I always knew that this mode existed, but I never really spent too much time with it. While capturing this footage with my friend, I think that this makes for one of the best co-op experiences on the Nintendo 64. And honestly, Sin and Punishment is one of the few Nintendo 64 games that I think really just holds up. Ignore the visuals, but the gameplay and everything, it's just so fast paced. The controls are really tight. This is honestly just a really great experience, and it's one of the best on-rail shooters I've ever played. So if you haven't played this with a friend, I highly recommend you try that out. And finally, let's talk about the Game Boy Advance. There are only 2 co-op games on Nintendo Switch Online for the Game Boy Advance. But one thing that's cool about this is that you can now play these games online. And there's also a system link option. So if you have 2 Nintendo Switches with 2 Nintendo Switch Online memberships, you can link up either in the same room or online. Kirby and the Amazing Mirror. This is one of those games where you really love it or you hate it. I personally love it. This is basically a Metroidvania Kirby game, and you can play it with up to 4 players. You're going to be going through various levels and trying to find items that will help you move on to the next level. One thing that's cool is when you're playing with your friends, you don't even have to go to the same level. You could each go into different levels and divide and conquer that way. And if one player is struggling, you're able to call for assistance and have one of your teammates join you. Co-op Metroidvanias are kind of a rarity, and this is actually one of my favorites in that genre. But I'm also just a really big Kirby fan, so maybe I'm biased. But if you haven't played this game, I highly recommend it. It's really one of the best co-op Kirby experiences ever. Now let's talk about The Legend of Zelda 4 Swords. I believe this is the first co-op Zelda game ever, and this is different from 4 Swords Adventures, which was the game that required Game Boy Advances and the GameCube. This is a standalone that was only on the Game Boy Advance. And basically you just play through various dungeons, and you can play it with up to 4 players in co-op. There are a number of puzzles that will require teamwork, and these change up based on how many players you have. We were only able to play it with 2 players when capturing this footage, but the experience is pretty much the same, but you just add more players. There's also somewhat of a competitive nature where you want to collect as many rupees as you can, and at the end of each dungeon, the player with the most rubies wins some sort of prize. This game is often overlooked, and I think that's just because it required multiple systems and cartridges in order to play it. And when you think of 4 Swords, most people think of the GameCube game, but this one's really solid as well. It's just not as in-depth of an experience, and it can be played through pretty quickly. So it's more of like a proof of concept, and the ultimate 4 Swords experience is that GameCube version, but this one is still definitely worth trying out. And those are all of the co-op games for the Nintendo Switch Online service. Are there any that we missed? And yeah, there's probably some sports games mixed in there that I could have covered, but I always intentionally just leave those out. It's just not what I want to talk about. Okay? If you enjoyed this video, why don't you check out our video from last week where we talked about every single co-op game that's exclusive for the Nintendo Switch. And thanks for watching.